Well, we meet again, dearest students. This particular video recorded lecture session is dedicated for all students in various courses for whom we cover particular selected readings from the New Testament. So THL 363, the New Testament in the Eternal City. THL 360, the History and Theology of the Papacy. RL 221, the Popes of Rome, History of the Catholic Church. And RL 225, Mystics, Saints, and Sinners, Studies of Medieval Catholic Culture. You already have your worksheets, so you know which worksheet to use for this particular video recorded lecture session on just 3 very brief passages from this thing we call the New Testament. The life and times of Jesus of Nazareth and his first immediate followers, the first century. Just as a general overview, as you look at your outline, your worksheet here with the bullet points, as you meticulously transcribe your notes, general overview, first of all, the New Testament. So to understand the New Testament, the earliest written records we have of this thing called Christianity, one needs to have some understanding of the general context in which it arose, namely, some basic understanding at this time of this first great monotheistic religion, Judaism, and the even wider, more complicated, complex context in which both Judaism and Christianity coexisted at this time, namely the Roman Empire. We've already discussed a lot of things about the ancient Roman Empire, but not really so much about Judaism. So to begin with, the New Testament itself, that is the second half of the Christian Bible, which also contains the Old Testament, or precisely the Hebrew Scriptures. The New Testament is important, among other reasons, not just regarding the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, his first followers, and the basis for what would become Christian theology, but the fact that the language in which it was originally written was not only ancient Greek, but a particular kind of ancient Greek called Koine, K-O-I-N-E, Koine, meaning common, the common tongue. And the New Testament is one of the only, and certainly the only large body of this particular kind of ancient Greek language that we have in existence. And the reason why it's so important is because Koine Greek was never written down. The common tongue, Koine Greek, was what people spoke on the streets, going about their day-to-day business, what they probably spoke at home. In other words, a spoken language, not a written language. And therefore, no one ever wrote in this particular kind of ancient Greek except the authors of the New Testament. Why did they do this? Because they were dumb and stupid and ignorant? Well, maybe some were not that well versed in classical or Attic Greek, but the real reason is another thing that's often lost on people. The New Testament, 27 books, we say, 27 separate books of the New Testament. 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which contain the so-called ipsissima verba, the words themselves of Jesus Christ. In fact, nowhere else in the New Testament, outside the 4 Gospels, do we have Jesus ever speaking in the first person. It's only in the 4 Gospels. Another book called The Acts of the Apostles, which a lot of biblical scholars tend to suppose is really kind of like a second half to the Gospel of Luke. The book of the Apocalypse, the Revelation. Chronologically, if you open the New Testament, the last book you'll find. It was also the last book to be written, but lots of biblical scholars tend to look at it as the second half of the Gospel of John. And then, so that's 6 books right there. All of the others, the other 21 books, are what we call epistles or letters, most of which were written by this guy, Paul, to whom we're coming as we look at this first of these 3 passages that we're going to examine somewhat in depth. In any event, all of these books, we say, when you think of a book, you think you're going to open up, crack a book, and read it, right? That's not what the books of the New Testament, the Gospels, and certainly the letters of Paul were ever meant to be. They were never meant. In other words, in the first century, the authors of these books are composing them. They never imagined that, let's say, as of the 21st century, most people that have any idea of the New Testament, that consult it for whatever reason, are usually reading it, not listening to it. That was the primary impetus behind the authors of the New Testament. They didn't sit down to write a great novel. And I'm not implying fiction or anything like that. They set out to write these things precisely so that they would be read aloud or proclaimed for a live audience. And that's one of the reasons why the wording, if you read it, sounds awkward. Another reason is obviously because most people are reading the New Testament in a modern translation, which poses a whole other set of problems to which we're going to come as we look at these particular passages. And finally, just linguistically, philologically speaking, the New Testament is precious because it's, as I said, the only body of literature that we have in ancient Greek that captures, that records this unique form of ancient Greek, which again was only spoken, to be listened to be heard. And that leads us to the first particular passage that we are going to look at, the so-called first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. And it was composed by this guy, Paul, around the year 50. So they're right in the middle of the first century. If you want to say the 50s in the first century, that's fine. So right in the middle of the first century. The reason why this particular passage we look at first is because of those 27 books of the New Testament, it's this first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, which is the first of the New Testament, the first thing of the New Testament to be written. So before the Gospels were even composed. Doesn't matter that when you open the New Testament and you look at the chronological order of the books as they're laid out, that the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians comes after the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles. Doesn't matter. In terms of when these particular books were composed, namely between roughly with this first one, the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, because he has a second letter to the Corinthians that we're not going to look at, obviously. The New Testament was composed somewhere between about the year 50 and by the year 110. With some question about that on the part of biblical scholars, historians, theologians, scholars of patristic sciences, because the earliest complete version that we have of what we today understand as the New Testament, these 27 books. The oldest extant complete version that we have of that, it's only about from the year 200. 200. That's over 150 years after the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, and it's at least 100 years after the life and times of his first disciples, apostles, some of whom were evangelists, the authors that actually composed these books of the New Testament. Moreover, this particular selection, this particular passage, the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 1 through 8, of this first book of the New Testament to be written, this particular passage we're going to look at, this is the first part of that letter. Biblical scholars pretty much have consensus on this, that was composed. Don't be fooled by the fact that it says chapter 15. So chronologically within this book, this first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 15 is kind of down the way. Doesn't matter. This is actually the first part of that letter of this first book of the New Testament to be composed. So at the very least, it's important because of that, but we're also about to find out what is so important about these just eight verses in the Greek, ancient Greek text, which you see on your worksheet, only about 100 words. And even in the English translation that you have to accompany it, only about 150 words. What could be so important about so little written? Well, we're going to find out. But before we do, we need to find out, we need to understand something then about this world in which it was born, the New Testament, in Jerusalem, in the greater Jerusalem area, in the first century. And that has to do with understanding a very tense dynamic between what are referred to now as the Jews, the Jewish people, and the ancient Roman Empire. To begin with, if you were walking around Jerusalem or the greater Jerusalem area at this time in the first century, certainly before the first century, and you ran into somebody on the street and asked, are you a Jew? Are you Jewish? They would not know what you were talking about. At this time, the Jews referred to themselves as what they had always referred to themselves as: Israelites, Hebrews, children of the great patriarchs, Abraham, etc., children of Israel, not Jews. So how did this name come about? The Romans. The Romans annexed this particular area of the world, what was the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, or Judah, just for the sake of argument, very easily, around the year 0, late 1st century BCE. This part of the world they annexed was the kingdom of Judah, because the kingdom of Israel had already collapsed. And so the Romans just took that Hebrew word, Judah, as in the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Judah, and they transliterated it into Latin, as in Judea, Judea. Hence, the people that inhabited that province, the ancient Romans referred to as Jews. Okay. The other thing is that whenever the Romans annexed provinces, as the Roman Empire expanded, starting now and obviously for the next several centuries, they had a great dilemma with what to do with the peoples that they had just annexed, conquered, whatever you want to call it. Do we grant general amnesty to these people? Citizenship? No. That eventually will happen in the ancient Roman Empire in the year 211 and 212 with something called the Antonine Constitution, but that's for another time. Moreover, then, if they're not going to be citizens, are they subject to Roman law? The Romans, always very pragmatic, practical, decided, no. Here's what we're going to do. Whatever government these particular areas that we've now annexed, and we're going to call them our provinces, whatever governmental system, even religions, cultures, traditions, whatever they have going on, we're not going to, at least immediately or directly, get involved in. We'll let things continue as they are. And consequently, whatever governmental system, whatever laws that these peoples are using, will allow them to govern themselves if they're not Roman citizens. We're only going to do or expect from these peoples, given our magnanimity, the ancient Romans, is two things. One, we will provide security for these peoples, even if they have their own soldiers and, armies or police. We'll let them keep that, but in terms of real security, it will be the Roman legions, the legionaries, providing that security. Cynical, be always cynical, pragmatic, practical. It's to the Romans' interests to do that, because they want to make sure that things are being run, controlled as they want them to be. They don't want any interference. It's to their own interests economically, because what lies beyond that particular province, especially if it's not another Roman province? An enemy, potentially. Okay. Not even back then did money grow on trees. So how are we going to pay for all of this? Taxes. So the Romans collect taxes on people. Okay. With that said then, well, what is the particular governmental system, law, that this group of people, the Jews now, in the Roman province of Judea, what is their system? It's a monarchy. They have a king, so the Romans allow the king to stay in power. And the governing body of the king, in order to make sure that laws are being enforced, followed, respected, is something called the Sanhedrin in Hebrew, or the Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin. And this was a tripartite system made up of three equally tripartite system, three groups that shared equal power but had different roles. The first group, the Pharisees. You would say today lawyers, as in attorneys. However, they also had a role of law enforcement. So not just lawyers or attorneys, but also kind of police, enforcing the law. The second group, the Sadducees. And these would correspond to today what are referred to as jurists or jurists. In the United States, unless you're in the legal profession, you probably have never heard of that. But you have heard of justices, not judges, but justices. Justice, jurist. That is, those legal experts who write opinions on the law, how a particular law or laws should be interpreted, applied, etc. Okay. The third group, the scribes. Today, you might think of these as stenographers, court reporters, or archivists, those who keep all the records. And I said this was a tripartite system. Each group was equally important. And you might be wondering, really? A court reporter is just as important as a lawyer. And if you think about it today, well, maybe. But certainly back then, because when you calculate that less than 1% of the population was literate, could read and or write, then anybody who is able to read and write, like a scribe, scribo, I write in Latin, that's where the word comes from, like scriptures, things having been written. Okay. If you can do that in such a world, you have an immense amount of power. Okay. What then is the law that they're dealing with? Mosaic law. Not as in the beautiful, stunning mosaics that you will have seen at some point here in the eternal city of Rome. Mosaic as in Moshe or Moses, the Old Testament, the guy that went up to Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments. There's actually about 1,000 commandments, but we usually just think of 10. Okay. So that law, as in Moses, Mosaic law, that is the law that runs internally the Roman province of Judea for these people, the Jews. Before Paul got really famous as Paul, he was not known as Paul. Rather, he was known as Saul, S-A-U-L. And Saul was a Pharisee. Therefore, he was thoroughly well-versed in Mosaic law. Secondly, Saul was a Roman citizen. And consequently, in his education and just experience of now having to deal with the Romans, would have been thoroughly familiar, to say the least. Probably very well versed in Roman law. And consequently, another reason why, in particular, his epistles, his letters, and again, he would wind up writing 50% of the New Testament. In fact, some biblical scholars and historians like to suggest that it was really Paul that made Christianity what it is. And there's something to be said for that. Regardless of one's religious, particular religious belief, denomination, or lack thereof, the vast majority of historians, anthropologists, etc., if you had to guess one figure, suggest one figure, certainly in the ancient world, that was the most influential, not Socrates, it's not Plato, it's not Aristotle, not even Alexander the Great. It's this guy, Paul. Forever after, changing the direction, reshaping the direction, not just of Western civilization, but really the entire world because of so many ideas that he had, again, to which we're coming shortly. Saul, famously as recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, had a life-changing moment, an episode referred to as the road to Damascus. Again, Saul's a Pharisee, which meant he was also responsible for enforcing the law. And somewhere, maybe in the late 40s, first century here, at some point, the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem sends Saul to investigate a group of meddling Jews in Damascus and Syria who are preaching heresy because they're claiming that this disgraced carpenter, would-be rabbi, named Jesus of Nazareth, was the long and waited for Mashiach, or Messiah. So, he's sent on this mission to investigate and take care of matters if necessary, meaning executing people if they were found guilty. And on the way, on the road to Damascus, according to this guy himself, Saul, he has an encounter with the resurrected, albeit, but living Jesus Christ. Remember, Saul presumably, never knew Jesus during Jesus' own lifetime. Okay, so he has this encounter. Saul's convinced, which will wind up leading to him getting baptized, and therefore Christian, changing his name to Paul. So now it's Paul. And becoming, famously, the most ardent disciple, believer, preacher of the gospel. Okay. So that's just a background on the New Testament, and in particular, its most famous proponent, the forgotten last 13th apostle, Paul. With that, we're now going to take a look at this first passage.